Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's LaRouche PAC meeting. This is the 2nd of July. Actually, the day that the legislature, the Constitutional Convention in 1776 voted up the resolution to declare independence from the British Empire. Less well known than July 4th, but July 2nd was when the vote was actually taken. And then the text was voted up on the 4th of July. So July 2nd. We're going to be discussing today a feature, very important feature of what it will require to restore the United States to its position as a city on the hill, as a leader in the world as a democratic republic. And so we're going to be talking about the role of the FBI, touching a bit on the Office of Special Investigations as well, and particularly in their targeting of the NASA space program, the manned mission in particular, and the effect that has had, which carries forward a unfortunate, disastrous black tradition, which dates back to the Cold War, to the Red Scares of the late 1940s and 50s, but also encompasses the period of the assassinations of the Kennedys, of Martin Luther King, and right up through Brylab and Abscam, to the current exposure of the FBI in the 28 pages in the 9/11 disaster of 2001, and their attempt to cover up the Saudi role. But we're going to focus today on NASA and their role in taking down the U.S. space program, and what it's going to take to get them out of the way, which is the intention of this gathering in part. So, but let me first start out, importantly, LaRouche is once again pulling together the institutional forces internationally to pull civilization, to pull mankind out of the hole, and specifically the transatlantic region, but internationally. The conference that we just held in Berlin on the 25th and 26th was an extraordinary conference held by the Schiller Institute under the auspices of the Schiller Institute, with participation from 4 continents, an extraordinary group of speakers, not just speakers but participants. These are individuals who largely self-selected themselves out as leaders at this time of crisis. And I'll just give you some sense of a few of these speakers and what they spoke on, to get in that way just give you a brief sense of the conference. The conference proceedings can be found at newparadigm.schillerinstitute.com. The full proceedings will be there. Much of it already, the videos are being put up now, so definitely take advantage of that. But the lead-off presentation was by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, titled "The Future of Mankind Will Be Beautiful, Provided We Can Avoid the Fate of the Dinosaurs." Ambassador Chas Freeman, the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and who is also the main interpreter for President Richard Nixon on his trip to China that opened up U.S.-China relations, spoke second. "Things fall apart, America, Europe, and Asia in the New World Disorder," in which he came out strongly in support of collaboration with the BRICS nations, particularly China, in building out the new Silk Road and Eurasian land bridge policies. The next speaker was to be Vladimir Yakunin, who's a close collaborator and advisor to President Putin. He was unable to attend. His remarks will be made available. The second panel included Jacques Cheminade, candidate for president of France, the pre-candidate for the position of president of France, followed by Marco Zanni, the head of the 5-star delegation to the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. He was followed by Daisuke Kodegawa of the Canon Institute of Japan, the former representative of Japan to the International Monetary Fund. And he was followed by Ambassador Christinopoulos, the former ambassador to Poland, Canada, and Armenia from Greece, and also the former Secretary General of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, and so on and so forth. There was additional panels. I don't have the time to review them all, but briefly included as well was Colonel Alain Corvès of the International Consultant, former advisor to the French Defense and Interior Ministries. Will American hubris come to an end, or will it disappear with us in a universal combustion? And also, let me single out the participation of Her Excellency Dr. Luthania Shaban, representing the presidency of the Syrian Arab Republic, who addressed the conference by video and then by Skype connection, being refused entry into Germany. So that gives you some sense of the participation. And the intention was to address the threat of war and the stress and develop the kind of collaboration now needed among nations to set a different path. So with that in mind, let us begin to look at what really was, first of all, the intent of the U.S. space program. And I want to turn to the speech by John F. Kennedy, given in September 20th of 1963, shortly before his assassination. This speech doesn't get as much attention, really, as it should. In it, he called for cooperation with the Soviet Union on a mission to the moon as part of a broader cooperation among the nations of mankind for the exploration of outer space. And he said, in part, after reviewing the tensions of the years that had preceded this, including, of course, the '62 missile crisis. Keep that in mind. Despite that, here he was giving this just singular speech to the United Nations General Assembly. After that review of the past history, he said, finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint effort in the regulation and exploration of space. And then an emphasis, I include, Kennedy continued, among these possibilities, a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, Kennedy continued, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplication of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. And that really speaks to, I think, the intention, the deep, profound intention of the space program, as understood by those German-American scientists that made such a contribution, who wrote extensively on this, including, of course, Kraft Erika, our dear friend, former advisory board member to the Schiller Institute. And And I think to all of them, certainly the leading thinkers, and this is very important when we come to this issue of the attack on NASA and the taking down of the NASA programs and what it's going to take to revive them. So fast forward to today, there still is that initiative. Now it's coming in particular from China. 2 weeks ago, China and the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs announced that they had signed an agreement to collaborate on the upcoming Chinese space program, which will be launched beginning in 2018, 2 years away approximately. China will be putting up a major, it will become an international space station, which will then begin replacing our space station, or the ISS, International Space Station, which will be running out its lifespan, at least it's currently planned. So the core module will go up in 2018. There already are discussions with the European Space Agency and with Roscosmos, the Russian space program, and in particular on the presentation of the agreement, they stated that space exploration is the common dream and wish of all of mankind, and they particularly emphasized the benefit of utilization of China's space station by developing countries. As well, you had the recent conclusion of the China-Russia deal to import from Russia the RD-180 engines, and for Russia to gain access to Chinese micro radio technology. But the Russian representative, the ambassador to China from Russia, Denisov, stated, "Our country has substantial potential accumulated in the sphere of engine making. This is a well-known fact. I would emphasize cooperation in outer space activities as a whole, rather than a specific delivery of a batch of goods. The point is not to deliver specific equipment, but to organize long-term, mutually advantageous cooperation of the sides which are objectively close to each other from this viewpoint of technical and technological capabilities," and so on. Now, this is also still there in the US space program itself. Charles Bolden, the director of NASA, has emphasized both last year and again this year his desire for the United States to begin cooperation again with China in space programs. At the conference, the International Astronautical Congress last year, he stated the following: "The reason I think that where we are today, that is, we're under current congressional law, the US scientists are banned from participating with China or cooperating with China on a one-on-one basis. Where we stand today is temporary, is because of a practical statement that we will find ourselves on the outside looking in, because everybody who has any hope of a human spaceflight program will go to whoever will fly their people." So Bolden has emphasized the response, by the way, of China to that. Xu Dazhi, the administrator of the Chinese National Space Agency, said, "We certainly hope that this temporary time frame can be shortened. China has no difficulties in our cooperation policies with other nations." So the potential there for broader collaboration, essential to eclipsing the current confrontational policy, which is dominating relations between the United States under the Obama administration with Russia and China, is within reach. And this could be incredibly important. Now let's turn to the attack on NASA. And I'm going to take you briefly back to 1991. and what was called lightning strike, the FBI operation that targeted the Johnson Space Center in particular, and targeted the entire NASA program. In December of 1991, a operation was launched by the FBI through the NASA Inspector General's office, utilizing an FBI agent going by the nom de plume of John Clifford. His actual name was Hal Francis, who had carried out a similar sting operation called Operation Brown Bag in St. Louis. Now he was going to be coming, to Houston, and an entire framework, a background, a company was created with a financial background, history, and so forth, which he was put in nominal charge of to run his operations, to sting NASA contractors and employees, to entrap them, because in fact, as the results showed, there was no sting. There was no one wishing to commit a crime or committing a crime, but the FBI essentially entrapped. And again, this comes back to what we're dealing with right down to today in terms of the recent Orlando massacre. The question of FBI involvement with Mateen, the fact that they had attempted to set him up in a sting operation, which has become public now, raises the question of how deeply was the FBI involved in manipulating Mateen. So this ongoing role of the FBI is not something, again, without direct consequences for us right now. But Francis started out by targeting top executives of NASA, including James Beggs, who had been forced out of the United Nations, or out of NASA a few years earlier. I'll come back to that. But when he ran into a stone wall, Francis shifted gears and targeted contractors. And I just want to give you a sense of these contractors. Anyone who knows the community around Johnson Space Center even today will I think appreciate this picture as being really a fair picture. Let me see here. The Jacksons, Karen and Neil Jackson. The Jacksons, I'm reading from a report that was in Texas Monthly Magazine. This was in the August 1996 issue. If you want to, so this is a few years after the sting operation, looking back, and it's really quite comprehensive. But he begins early on painting a picture. Karen and Neil, the Jacksons, Karen and Neil, were typical of the mom and pop entrepreneurs who lived in Clear Lake City and the other NASA bedroom communities south of Houston. A close-knit group of scientists, engineers, and business people, well-educated, ambitious, dedicated to the exploration of space. The older ones had arrived in Houston in the 60s, the dawn of America's space program. But most had hitched their wagons to NASA in the 70s and 80s while they were still in school. Many had dreamed of being astronauts, but had settled for positions as support troops. Neil Jackson had 10 years of service as an Air Force pilot when McDonnell Douglas hired him in 1983 to train astronauts. Like others in the industry, Neil and Karen moved into a tidy middle-class neighborhood where names like Saturn, Gemini, Apollo, and Challenger seemed painted on every street sign, shopping center, park, or donut shop. And the article continues to report on the phone call that they received to their company, Horizons Discovery Group, their mom and pop company, from this John Clifford, offering an opportunity $1 million potential opportunity. And this was Clifford's, Hal France's, FBI Special Agent Hal France's proposition, that Neil Jackson would guarantee his services as a contract man for the next 12 months, introducing Clifford and his company to the most important people in the community. Clifford mentioned in particular Carolyn Huntoon, the director of the Life Sciences Project Division at Johnson Space Center. And what he was shopping was something called a lithotripter, a miniaturized version, which could smash kidney stones without surgery, and so forth. And then they expanded it to apply to other medical procedures in terms of how they attempted to market this thing. But at that time, these lithotrippers had to be pulled on 18-wheel trucks. I mean, that's roughly the size of them. But supposedly, Hal France and his company had developed a miniaturized version that could be used potentially in space, for example, on the space station and so on and so forth. So this is what was being marketed. But this was the operation. And approximately a year later, after drawing in a total of some 18 people that were actually targeted and prosecuted, or at least initially, the initial steps of prosecution were taken. The whole operation was wrapped up, and these people were rolled up in it. None of these people were ever found guilty of any serious felony crimes. When they were brought in one at a time into a warehouse in South Houston. They were presented with huge blow-ups of themselves in various apparently compromising positions. From being at titty bars, as they referred to them, to the handling of money, to unfortunate kind of meetings or guilt by association sorts of situations. Almost all of them pled guilty rather than go to trial under the conditions of this kind of 1984 environment in which they were put through. They would be shown boxes of videotapes and cassette tapes, of the conversations that had been collected of them through the entire period.
Then in compromised situations?
Yes, in compromised positions, or at least alleged. It was left to the imagination what was involved in these tapes. I just mentioned that the one individual, Dale Brown, who actually fought this thing and ultimately won, in the sense of the hung jury, was prosecuted for a total of $500 that he was asked to deliver to another party by Hal Francis, and that in essence was the charge that was brought against him, his career, but also his physical health, suffered dearly for that, even though he was a young man being put through that. But let me explain. Let me turn to James Beggs for a second. First of all, he was interviewed by the Houston Press I believe it was 1995. It may have been a year earlier, by Steve McVicker. And James Beggs is the former director of NASA, national director of NASA. In the 1980s, he was prosecuted for similar kinds of alleged activities. He was forced to resign, and then afterwards, eventually all the charges were dropped against him. It was a complete railroad job. He was indicted in December 2nd, 1985. Now here's what he had to say to the Houston Press as regarding lightning strike. He said, and I'll come back to James Beggs because there's another aspect to this story. But he said, I think the whole idea of the government running stings in which you use government employees who lie and offer bribes with impunity, I think that's outrageous. I don't see any difference in that than what the Nazis did. What really disturbs me about them doing this kind of thing to NASA is that you sow the seeds of distrust among the people in the agency who are responsible for running a very difficult and exceedingly hazardous program. To sow the seeds of distrust deliberately in that program is about as despicable and disgusting and rotten a thing to do as I can imagine. That's James Biggs. Now, some of the implications of that. James Biggs was forced out of NASA shortly before the Challenger disaster. And we asked him about this after the fact, because at the time, watching this from afar, because he was no longer at NASA, when the Challenger was being prepared for launch from Cape Canaveral, he was asked whether the Challenger would be ready to fly that morning. And his comment was, "Brr, it's too cold." And this is what he told us in an interview a year later, roughly, in 1987, to the Executive Intelligence Review. He said, "It was a cold morning, and it had been below freezing through the night. And what you don't know with that vehicle is whether you've got internal ice." Morton Tholkel, Inc. engineer Alan McDonald, Biggs stated, voiced objections to the launch on a number of counts. And there were several good reasons why we wouldn't have launched this morning. McDonald was, quote, worried about several things that morning, including ice on the gantry and the effect of the cold on a number of components in addition to the booster seals, Biggs stated, which is what I would have been worried about had I been down there, which he had been down there for every launch, you know, while he was director of NASA. So the Challenger disaster was, in part at least, the outcome of the FBI's sting operation or investigation targeting of James Biggs as the director of NASA in 1985. Now, so I think just to make the point, to emphasize it, this question of destroying collaboration. Think in terms of what we're pulling together, what's being pulled together around the New Silk Road, around the Eurasian Land Bridge, with our conference, our critically important conference in Berlin coming, you know, just days after the Brexit vote, and the whole direction of Europe, certainly, you know, in the air. And think of the requirement for the building up of trust and collaboration, and the way in which it's exactly this collaboration, which is what's targeted in these operations, these sting operations, which not only, you know, are intended not only to take out individuals, but as Biggs pointed out, to destroy the ability of the organization to function. So let me make a shift again here. Let me go to the German-American scientists, and we'll come back to this thread on the FBI and related organizations. Because I think it's important just to underscore, when we're talking about people like Werner von Braun, Kraft Erika, Hermann Oberth, and the development of the original rocket societies, which gave birth to what became the later rocket programs and space programs of the last 30, 40 years. That we understand that their outlook, and I'm not going to go into detail. We've been presenting, for example, Kraft Erica's ideas in recent weeks at our conferences, and is available on the LaRouche PAC website as well. To summarize, I'm bringing this up because of the attempt to present these German-American scientists as somehow Nazis, as somehow tainted by the fact that they came over here in Operation Paperclip from Germany. And so just stepping back, first of all, the space program goes back much deeper than most people realize. You know, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of the Russian space program, drew up in 1898 the specifications for what it would require to lift a rocket, you know, of varying size, requirements of fuel versus weight and you know, gravitational pull and thrust and so forth. He worked these out in 1898, and they were published the same year that the Wright brothers were at Kitty Hawk. It's extraordinary. In terms of the, you take Robert Goddard, the American space pioneer, and similarly with Hermann Oberth, the Romanian German-speaking scientist who ended up working with at Peenemünde, but then also was part of the U.S. space program. These individuals all had as their driving outlook this idea of going into outer space. That was their intention. Goddard, to try to raise money, first of all, did succeed in raising money from the Smithsonian Institute, but then to carry forward on, in World War I, approached the U.S. military and received money from the Signal Corps to develop rocket-powered devices for military use. But the minute the war ended, the funds were cut. Oberth, too, similarly. I mean, you can imagine, from what we know now in terms of what it takes to put man into space, these are enormous, enormous projects. And the motivation was, well, let me just see if I can, Oberth's The Rocket book, which he had to publish himself, but immediately began selling out. This was in the 1920s. In the third part of the book, he describes what his enormous rocket that he imagined that he had drawn up and designed and so forth, which was, the upper stage was in fact hydrogen-oxygen fueled, which was something that was not achieved until 3 or 4 decades later, really. The Model E, that would carry humans into other worlds. The chapter addressed problems of space flight and solutions. The ship's pilot would use periscopes to view the Earth and stars. Hooks and straps would keep the crew from floating weightless around the ship's interior. The space travelers would be outfitted in specially pressurized suits with tanks of liquid oxygen and nitrogen, supplying artificial air supply, and so on. In other words, and you find this in Tsiolkovsky's writings as well, you know, very forward-looking. You know, they weren't out there. They were already, you know, thinking through the kinds of problems they knew that had to be mastered. This was the direction, this is the drive, the way in which they were going. Further, I think it's worth underscoring that Hitler, in terms of Peenemünde, which a little bit more on that in a second, but Hitler himself did not become interested in what became known as the V2, which was actually the A4, but what was named the V2 until 1943. Hitler had no interest in the rocket program at Peenemünde. This was something that dated back to the period, the 1920s, between World War I and II. In fact, if I can find it quickly here, the actual the conditions under the armistice, under the Versailles Treaty, were such that the German military was not only limited to 100,000 soldiers, but it could have no air force, it could have no artillery, it essentially had no munitions, could not produce munitions, so that the National Defense of Germany essentially did not exist. This was just part of the this was another aspect to what people more generally know of the reparations policy of Germany that was imposed on Germany at the end of World War I, which led directly into World War II, led to the rise of Hitler and into World War II. So that the interest of the Russian military, before Hitler was ever on the scene, was in the possibility of new physical principles that could be applied to defense. In other words, would not be encompassed by the Versailles Treaty, would be outside the limits imposed by the Versailles Treaty. Rocketry was one of those. You know, this was a totally unexplored, I mean, to a large extent, rockets were like, you know, like what you think of kids playing with on July 4th at that point.
They weren't excluded?
We're not, no, there was nothing that weren't mentioned because it was just a completely unknown field, right? It was not even thought about in terms of its military uses, at least from the standpoint of the treaty. I mentioned that Robert Goddard had already worked with the U.S. military for a short time in developing certain projects. But in general, no, it just was not included in the treaty. So, so the German military approached the rocket societies, and people like Werner von Braun, who was not one of the founders, but the early rocket societies in Berlin and elsewhere, to see what the possibilities were, and to see these rockets go 200 feet up in the air and so on and so forth. I mean, you know, this was not, you know, this was not major rocket science yet in terms of what was being constructed. So you had this situation where you had these scientists, what were scientists and engineers, many of them completely unemployed at that time, because this is in post-World War I Germany, who are volunteering their time to build these rockets, you know, and find space where they can launch them without, you know, basically getting the townspeople completely in an uproar about some rocket coming through their house or something. And so the opportunity to connect up with the military became, you know, this was an opportunity. And so that work began right in Berlin, and then later was moved to Peenemünde as a larger testing site and facility that could be developed for these projects.
Was that on the coast?
Yes, on the Baltic. Peenemünde was on the Baltic, yes. And Werner von Braun was chosen as chief collaborator with the German military on these projects because he seemed to be, even though he's younger than several of the other more experienced rocket scientists, shall we call them, he was a problem solver, and he was somebody who had a good approach to administration, just a knack for administration and working with people and so on. So von Braun became a real key person early on in the program. So General, then Captain, later General Walter Dornberger became the head for the German military of the. He was in the artillery section for the of the rocket program, and headed up Peenemünde. He actually worked then in the United States on Dynasaur, DYNASOAR, which was the forerunner of the U.S. space program, or U.S. shuttle program, just to make a connection there. If we can come back to that if there are questions, but I want to then proceed in terms of this, come back to this question of what I'm identifying as the FBI. And just briefly, we've had a series of articles in the Executive Intelligence Review beginning in August of last year, August 21st, 2015 issue by Barbara Boyd, who presents some of this in more detail. But just briefly, there's been a series of books in the last 10, 15 years which have identified how the FBI was created, the actual mothers of the FBI, if you will. Books by Kurt Gentry, Alfred McCoy, Ralph Van Damon. And what they identify very specifically is the role of British intelligence working with the U.S. Army in creating G2, that is German U.S. military intelligence, and in turn creating what became the Federal Bureau of Investigations. The key figure in this, American figure, is Ralph Van Damon, D-E-M-A-N, who up until 1952 was J. Edgar Hoover's closest collaborator. And he is known as the father of American military intelligence. He got his training in the Philippines first, in the period around World War I, and then he deployed himself to British colonial India to gain firsthand experience there with British methods of counterinsurgency. And then, in working with Hoover, he continued to organize and run countless private citizen and group vigilante operations in the United States, such as the American Protective League, the American Legion, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and so on, against alleged communists, trade unionists, ethnic groups. Think of the known role of the FBI in orchestrating the actions of the Ku Klux Klan. Is just an example of this kind of thing as well. One of the targets of this, if you think that this is not related to science, one of the key targets of Hoover and company in these days, going back to the 1930s, early 1930s, was Albert Einstein, which Barbara Boyd covers in her article. He was targeted, this is just part of the story, he was targeted over decades, he and his wife both. Einstein was an incredibly political figure, as well as the scientific genius we know him as otherwise, or should know him as otherwise. He was extremely political. You know, this bifurcation didn't exist between politics and science, and shouldn't today either. But Hoover considered his inability to pin the red label or the spy label on Einstein to be one of his greatest failings as FBI director. Einstein was originally targeted, this is before he even moved to the United States, by a organization created out of Van Damon's operation called the Women's Patriotic Corporation, which was headed up by a Miss Randolph Frothingham. No kidding. She prepared, this Miss Randolph Frothingham, with help, of course, prepared a dossier on Einstein. He was their chief target. He was the top of their list that America had to be guarded from. You know, one of the worst undesirables. You know, communists, pacifists, feminists, you know, whatever. These had to be guarded against, and Einstein was #1 on their list. And this dossier was prepared, and this dossier haunted Einstein to his death. This was circulated through institutions, it was debunked and so on, but you know, it kept coming back. Right? But here's Einstein's response, because Einstein was not about to be, you know, rolled over by this operation. He wrote in the New York Times, this actually appeared on the front page of the New York Times in 1932, December 4th. "Never yet have I experienced from the fair sex such rejection of all advances. Or if I have, never from so many at once. But are they not perfectly right, these watchful citizens? Why should one open one's doors to a person who devours hard-boiled capitalists with as much appetite as the ogre Minotaur in Crete once devoured luscious Greek maidens? A person who is also so vulgar as to oppose every sort of war, except the inevitable one with one's own wife. Therefore, give heed to your clever and patriotic womenfolk, and remember that the capital of mighty Rome was once saved by the cackling of its faithful geese." That's Einstein, Albert Einstein, on the front page of the New York Times. That's not the whole statement, but that's so. That's his he knew exactly. He knew exactly what he was dealing with.
That's his response to Frothingham and the operation.
Yeah, his initial response to the circulation of this dossier when it became known to him. So there was a there was an ongoing attempt to prevent him from even entering the United States in 1932. Run through the State Department. I mean, you know, you think of, you know, he was blacklisted. He was not allowed to work on the Manhattan Project because he was considered to be you know, an undesirable.
That was the same group that was going after the film industry during that time too, and I knew it was connected to the Daughters of the American Republic as well.
The what industry?
The film.
Oh, film.
Film industry, Hollywood.
What was connected to the?
That same group that he's just talking about, that was going after FBI operations, going after the scientists, going after Einstein.
Not.
Oh, you mean you're speaking of in the 1950s in Hollywood, going like the Hollywood 10 and so on?
Going after them, not they were going after the FBI.
The FBI was going after the DAR?
No.
Okay. The Daughters of the American Revolution was
utilized by Van Damon as a front operation to target undesirables.
Right.
And this group was a different name, but it's one
of these groups that Van Damon specialized in.
Right.
And that was in the early 30s.
Right.
Yes.
The early 30s, and the Hollywood operation was in the
50s.
Yeah, but it's the same group.
Yes,
the same. Yeah, same. Yeah, same profile. Yeah. So now, so this is then this is the actual context then for this in terms of the example of Einstein is a kind of window then into the whole targeting of the German American scientists who had come here in the aftermath of World War II and authored the U.S. rocket programs. I mean, the irony is that in all of these cases, you have, you know, these ideas were being shared across countries. I mean, there was never any intention by among the these rocketeers, you know, these lovers of rocket science to somehow keep their ideas somehow in a secret box. Nor is that the perspective of even the leading conservative scientists in the United States down to today. Just to mention Edward Teller, to the last days of his life, and he was in the Manhattan Project, was adamant that the secrecy imposed on the Manhattan Project and otherwise in general was completely counterproductive. That the inability of scientists to collaborate with other scientists in the discovery of physical principle was detrimental. And then in a democracy, or what you would wish to be a democracy or a democratic republic, ideas are going to be shared anyway. So there was no point to it. On certain technical things as to how to do something in particular, you know, he could see the reason for, you know, for withholding circulation of those reports and data and so on and so forth. But in terms of science, in terms of scientific principles, scientific work in general, the secrecy and the ability to impose secrecy was completely misplaced and destructive. But let me continue on another vein on this. In 1992, I mean, you know, you're talking about 40 plus years after the end of World War II, or excuse me, 1979. New York Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman called for the creation of a special unit to prosecute war criminals residing in the United States. And this became the Office of Special Investigations, which was created within the Department of Justice with powers to do all of the necessary steps itself in-house, from investigation, first investigation, all the way through litigation. The reason for the creation of the Office of Special Investigations was that between starting in the 1960s, there was a series of attempts through immigration authorities to prosecute foreigners, particularly from the Baltic countries, but from the Nazi era, let's just put it that way, who are now residing in the United States. And to attempt to, and of course this is again decades after the fact, to prosecute them. There were 5 total cases, and they lost 4 of the prosecutions. The one that they succeeded in winning, an alleged Gestapo officer, turned out to have been a former forced laborer, as opposed to being any kind of a Nazi officer or anything of the sort. So this was a total embarrassment. The result then was the creation of the Office of Special Investigations. Now the most famous case in general that people know of is, or may still remember, is Ivan Demyanik, who you may not recall. You can tell by the name. He was not German. He was a Russian prisoner of war. Demyanik. He was a Russian prisoner of war who was then put to work in labor camps in Germany, and was alleged to have been Ivan the Terrible, who oversaw the concentration camp or death facilities at Treblinka. The evidence turned out to be so bad based on Soviet intelligence. I mean, we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, but at that point, the Office of Special Investigations welcomed whatever Russian intelligence, the KGB and so forth, would hand over to us. And they were and then the OSI was using it to prosecute American citizens in the United States. But the evidence on even the Demyanik case, which is a very complicated case, I'm not going to try to review it, but the point is that when he was finally extradited to Israel to stand charges where there were people there who were witnesses and so forth, and therefore there was grounds for prosecution for him for these heinous crimes that he was accused of. The Israeli Supreme Court threw the case out for, you know, insufficient evidence. The Israeli Supreme Court. There's books written on this in Israel, became popular books. A three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th District ruled that the OSI attorneys had not met their obligations to work for justice and concluded that the OSI had perpetrated a fraud on the court. And this, again, this is a complicated case, but the demonic ultimately, well, as a result of the case being thrown out in Israel, came back to the United States, was allowed to come back to the United States because the charges had been tossed, right? He again became a U.S. citizen, and then several years later, new charges were brought against him, for which he was ultimately extradited to Germany to stand trial. Separate charge, not the same charges, but another set of charges. Otherwise, it'd be double jeopardy, right? But another set of charges was cooked up by the OSI, and on the basis of these charges, he was stripped of his citizenship, shipped to Germany, and the German government protested because this man had neither citizenship in Germany or anywhere else, and they demanded to have the evidence presented to him as to who this person was and whether there was the evidence that he should be tried in German court. Well, the evidence was reviewed, and the evidence was thrown out as insufficient. So in a nutshell, that's the Damiani case. But this also happened, a similar case was the case of Arthur Rudolph, Dr. Arthur Rudolph, who was the project manager for the Saturn rocket. He ran 100,000 employees, coordinated with dozens and hundreds really of private contractors in building the Saturn rocket. He had overseen the actual production of the V2 rocket at Peenemünde. And charges were brought against him in 1984, 40 years after the war had ended. You know, 39 years, I guess to be precise. He was the subject of investigation and threatened with his wife, threatened with his daughter, threatened, not knowing the circumstances and so forth. He agreed under pressure to leave the United States and return to Germany, which he did. And then he fought to have his citizenship restored in the United States. 108 NASA scientists from all backgrounds co-signed a letter to President Reagan seeking to have his citizenship restored. And the effort was led by General Roger Medeiros, who had headed up Operation Paperclip, working with the German-American scientists. Let me just did
he get it restored?
No.
No.
Well, maybe we can come back to if there's an interest. Let me. But Rudolph was accused of having, when Peenemünde was carpet bombed by the British Air Force in 1943, portions of the Peenemünde operation, the construction of the V2, were moved into an old gypsum mine, and forced labor was used in that gypsum mine. But in 1940, and Rudolph, because he was in charge of the production of the V2, he had actually developed the original engine for the V2, working with von Braun and others. He was in charge of moving the equipment into this gypsum mine. And then The following year, so a matter of months later, the SS took over from Dornberger, had convinced Hitler that they should be running Peenemünde, because now it was, the V2 was the Wunderwaffen. This is, you know, this was to exact revenge as Hitler saw it. Rudolph was, you know, and Dornberger were shoved out of the way. They, the SS, ran the show. Yet here, 40 years after the fact, Rudolph was being accused of having organized slave labor and been responsible for the deaths of people in the V2 production facilities, when he had nothing to do with the running of the facility. And in fact, his own immediate superior had been tried in 1947 by the U.S. Army in Germany and found not guilty. So, you know, the point was it was completely fabricated. This is, now I want to come to back to the U.S. policy with China, and to John Culberson, and our treatment of Chinese scientists. A few examples, but again, have in mind what's the attempt here. The attempt is to destroy the progress of mankind. The attempt is to disrupt the collaboration and cooperation, whether it's among nations or among teams of scientists, individuals, organizations. That's the principle of counterinsurgency, to create organizations, to play groups off against each other. That's the methodology that Van Damen and so forth brought from India, you know, to Army Intelligence G2 and into the FBI, and that's the basis of FBI operations. Now, the current this was originally passed in 2011. A two-sentence insertion into the U.S. Appropriation Act of that year, of 2015, by Congressman Wolf of Virginia, now retired, read, "None of the funds made available by this act may be used for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration or the Office of Space and Technology Policy to develop, design, plan, promulgate, implement, or execute a bilateral policy, program, order, or contract of any kind to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company, unless such activities are specifically authorized by a law enacted after the date of the enactment of this act."
What was the name of that act?
This is the Appropriations Act of 2015. It's just a two-sentence insertion into a paragraph. And that's still, I mean, it was, that's the current reading. The original two-sentence inclusion was in the 2011, but that same language is carried over to 2015. So sorry if I was confusing that. But the now, what is the basis of this? Congressman Culberson in early June held a town meeting here in Houston, which some of our collaborators, our organizers attended, and they challenged Culberson on the necessity of international cooperation on the exploration of space, including that town meeting was actually centered around the flooding, the recent flooding, the tax day flooding here in Houston. And of course, the events we've been having, the weather events globally, internationally, have raised the issue among serious scientists of understanding the cosmic causes for the changing weather patterns, which we're being affected by, mankind's being affected by. And this cooperation, I believe, was part of what was posed to Culberson. And Culberson's answer was, they steal everything, referring to the Chinese. And you don't know how many closed-door meetings I've had with the FBI about the Chinese. Now, he is the chairman, John Culberson, is the chairman of the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over the Department of Commerce, the Department of Justice, NASA, and the National Science Foundation.
It's a Science Justice Subcommittee?
Yes, Justice, which includes the FBI and NASA, are under the same subcommittee that controls the funding. That subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee controls the funds for both of those agencies.
Science Justice Subcommittee.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the full name again is Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee. So now Culberson is very outspoken, not just in his remarks at this meeting that we attended, but he's been very outspoken otherwise as regards how he thinks the NASA program should be run. For example, he's proposed the reform, I'm getting ahead of myself, of the NASA administration by modeling it on the FBI. He proposes that the directorship of the FBI be selected from a board of directors appointed by the president and Congress, and then confirmed from this board of directors, already pre-selected by the Congress and the president. And then his term in office would be for a certain duration of time.
10 years.
10 years, 20 years.
Yeah.
Right?
A lot of the Congress members are trying to go with that.
Now
Instead
think
of
about
being confirmed by the Senate. Instead of being confirmed by the Senate.
rather than simply being confirmed by the Senate. Right. So now think about that. Think of think of the current Congress. Would you want the current Congress to choose the director of NASA, for the next 10 years, 20-year period, where that person would then be in charge of everything that happened and didn't happen in NASA?
Well, that's a tough question. But you want Obama to choose that for president.
Yeah, right. Do you want Hillary Clinton? Do you want Donald Trump?
To choose.
Do you want,
So how is the director of NASA chosen now?
by the appointment by the President of the United States and confirmation through the U.S. Senate.
But you're
A
hoping
much
he will
simpler,
have John F. Kennedy president.
In other words, rather than addressing the actual issue, which is the education and mobilization of the American people to get the job done in space, as well as getting the job done here on Earth, like with Glass-Steagall measures, to put Wall Street through bankruptcy reorganization. Rather than taking those steps, you say, oh, gee, we're going to appoint somebody, might as well be for life or whatever. We're going to appoint somebody who will then be bulletproof and permanently in place. And he'll be able to run the show, he or she will be able to run the show the way they want.
And that board, just like with the healthcare advisory board, is not, there's no public recourse to who's on that board.
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So the proposal is for a board to select the NASA director?
Yeah, an appointment of a board of directors, like a corporate board of directors that would be appointed by the Congress and the president. And then they would select out a individual to be named as the head. They would select 3 candidates. And then among those 3 candidates, one would be chosen.
By whom? By the board?
By that board.
There would be no vetting by Congress or the Senate?
Well,
By the people.
it's
By the super Congress.
Yeah. In other words, I wouldn't make too much of it, except that he's using the example of the FBI and saying this is the model for how we want to run NASA as well. We've been picking it apart for years. We've been trying to destroy it for years. Lightning strike, taking out the best people like James Beggs, you know, feeding into a process that led to the Challenger explosion and so on and so forth. Now we want to just take it over and run it, you know, like the European Union Brussels bureaucracy runs Europe, or tries to, or doesn't run it, runs it into the ground. As if that's a solution. I mean, it's a misdirection of the American people by Culberson. And those who are going along with it as a gimmick. It's just a gimmick. It's not a solution. It's not a proposal. I mean, first of all, the funding of NASA has got to be massively increased, but Culberson's not about that. You know, he has a cat fight with Obama over, he wants a little more money, Obama wants a little less money, and so they have a cat fight over that. But in fact, the budget now is, half a penny a year of your tax dollars goes to NASA, when at its height it was 4.3 cents out of every dollar.
Over a national mission.
Yeah.
It's over what I want versus what you want.
Right. Yeah, as Keisha, just to make sure, Keisha said it's over what you want versus what I want, not about a national mission, not a deliberation on what should be the national mission and how do we get it done. But Culberson is utilizing this China aspect. This is did you have a question, Russ?
Yeah, can you imagine if that would be like they decided like the NASA leader, somebody like Sheila Jackson, like that,
right? Or Newt Gingrich, or
or an environmentalist.
Like, yeah, or an environmentalist. Put a green. Put Ralph Nader in charge of. Take the case of Bo Zhang. He was a NASA contract researcher working on source code for high technology imaging at NASA's Langley Research Center. In March 16, 2013, at Dulles Airport, he was picked up, about to return to China, and he was accused of espionage by Representative Frank Wolf, who was the predecessor to John Culberson. And John Culberson spends a lot of time praising Frank Wolf. And Frank Wolf was the one who originally stuck the legislation in 2 years prior, in 2011, to ban collaboration with China. On March 28th, that's 12 days later, the U.S. judge ordered the release of Zhang after a federal prosecutor acknowledged that there was no evidence that he possessed any sensitive, secret, or classified material. This is 3 years ago.
Going over to China?
Yeah. On May 2nd, 2013, he was exonerated in federal court of the only felony charge against him, which was that he was accused of lying to federal investigators. And he was exonerated despite all the hype in the media, that was drummed up around that time. Chinese spies, here's a Chinese spy, and so forth. On October 26, 2015, so 7-8 months ago now, right? But you're talking about more than 2 years later, right? John Culberson announced that 2 Langley Research Center advisors had been indicted. He was announcing this proudly, for complicity in espionage in the Bo Zhang affair, in which no evidence had been found, right? And he had been exonerated. And he released a press release on this. Yesterday's indictment is further proof of widespread negligence at NASA and throughout the Obama administration when it comes to protecting U.S. intellectual property and sensitive information. I want to thank my predecessor, Congressman Frank Wolf, who understood the threat posed by the Chinese. His leadership on this issue exposed many of the problems that have led us to this point. And so on. Recent attacks on U.S. IT systems clearly show that the Chinese are after every bit of information they can get their hands on, and so on. So I mean, this is the tone of this, just straight Red Scare propaganda. Straight. This is the kind of backroom information that John Culberson gets from the FBI. The actual direction that he gets from the FBI, I think, would be fair, closer to the truth of the matter.
It reminds me of the J. Edgar Hoover. I have a list. Was it not Hoover, but the guy from Wisconsin.
Joe McCarthy.
McCarthy. I have a list in my hands here of all the communists in the State Department and the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And of course it was all lies.
Yeah. So okay. So in later in October of 2015, one of these two NASA supervisors pled guilty and paid $500 fine for violating a NASA regulation. And that's what came out of this indictment, of espionage and collaboration with, complicity in espionage.
And that was 2015.
2015, yeah. The arrest of Bo Jiang was in March 16th of 2013. And they dragged that over 2 years in terms of the whole process. But even in May of 2013, he had Bo Jiang, it was already exonerated. But that's Culberson, right? This is the same Culberson that says that Al Qaeda, the FBI has informed them that Al Qaeda using Hispanic surnames are coming across the Mexican border. Right? Now, whether there is such a case or cases, the point is that this is complete hyperbolic nonsense in terms of the way Culberson utilizes it. A more recent case was Rongjing Li, who was a professor at Ohio State University, a noted professor who was both on the 2003 Mars rover mission, a participating scientist, on the 2009 lunar orbiter that circled the moon. He was noted for his mapping prowess and ran a major mapping and GIS laboratory at Ohio State University. In 2014, he resigned and returned to China to take care of his parents. The following year, the noise was made for about 2 or 3 days in the press that the FBI was investigating him for having left the year before, that he had shared defense secrets.
With his parents.
Yeah, because he was working at universities in China, Canada, and the United States. So he was obviously sharing secret information.
Will you say his name again?
This is Rong.
What is it?
Rongjing Li. The first name, R-O-N-G-X-I-N-G. That's at least spelled as one word in English. And then Li is L-I. But there's been nothing on him since. You can't find an article or anything about him, except for literally a window of 2 or 3 days where there was articles on this FBI investigation, and no charges have ever been brought. No charges. Nothing. Just a media event.
Is he still in China, or is he back at the US?
As far as I know, he's still back in China. I couldn't find anything. Can't find anything more. But this should also remind us of an earlier case, but it also indicates the window that's left open. The founder of the Chinese space program, Qian Shu-sen, was an American scientist who made important contributions on missile and space technology. He was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California, in Pasadena, Caltech, in 1943. Highly awarded, decorated. He is a colonel in the U.S. Army for part of his this period because it was, he was working with U.S. Army on ballistic missiles and so forth. In what's considered the second Red Scare, which is 1915-57, he was the target. He was targeted by Joe McCarthy and Roy Cong, and subject to 5 years of house arrest. He was never prosecuted. He was finally told he could go, and so he took, a U.S. ship, a passenger ship, back to China. In 1979, he was awarded Caltech's Distinguished Alumni Award for his lifetime achievements. Going back to China, he then carried out and developed and built out China's national space program, and making contributions to dozens of other fields, nuclear technology, nuclear energy, and so forth. I mean, he was a seminal figure. I mean, he was more than one top U.S. official said after the fact that it was the worst mistake this country ever made.
Will you say that name again?
Yeah, Qian Shu Shi, or I'm doing this too fast this time. Qian Shu Sen.
Can you spell it?
Qian, and the second name Xuesen.
Didn't he just die?
He passed away. No, not just recently. The head of the Indian space program passed away recently. He passed away, I believe. I could be wrong, but if I recall correctly, he passed away in 1996. Oh, was it 2009? Okay, then I'm thinking of somebody else. Okay. 2009. So I think that covers the highlights of what I wanted to cover. I hope there was a sweep to what I covered. To situate the lightning strike operation, but then to bring it up to date with what we're dealing with Culberson and so forth, and the FBI, and the cover up around 9/11, and this foreign infection, that we've got to root out in the United States.
Scare tactics to keep people from actually fighting for a human identity.
Mm-hmm. And Lyndon LaRouche's own prosecution in the middle of this is so central around this, Lynn's initiative, where he had pulled together, again, an international leadership around the Strategic Defense Initiative, and was then prosecuted by George Herbert Walker Bush, whose congressional district was created for George Herbert Walker Bush and is the district which John Culberson now occupies.
What area is that? Right.
Memorial Drive,
Oh, I didn't know.
West Side, very wealthy Republican district, is a lot out to Katy.
But doesn't it come all the way down to Braeswood?
Well, it comes down. I'm in the district. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to say is that, what you're kind of bringing together right now, I think these quotes from Beggs are, so significant, because if you think about, the quote where he says, to sow dissension and mistrust, distrust into a group that's actually involved in sensitive, hazardous, and extremely important groundbreaking work, is, the most evil thing you can do. That wasn't his word, but
like the Nazis.
But you compared it to the Nazis, and you think about you know, the operations that Hoover was running in the Congress. The FBI is still obviously running operations in the Congress, you know, buying people up, putting them in their pocket like Culberson. But, you know, this operation of sowing distrust, I mean, we know it. We know what was done in our organization. We know how this was done constantly to political groupings, that if they didn't control them, you know, they were out to destroy them, you know. But I just think about that, and you also brought up, I mean, this thing with Biggs, his target was 85, you say?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
December 2nd, 1985 was when he was indicted.
Right, which is just 2 years after the SDI was announced.
For procurement violations.
Yeah, just 2 years after the SDI was announced by Reagan, right? This was, you know, Lynn's project with Reagan, completely off the charts of these people. And NASA intersected everything that Lynn was working on.
And that was the same, that when Rudolph was being.
Yeah, targeted, yeah. So, I mean, I think we have to do much, much more on getting this out. I mean, obviously, the video of this that will be posted will be really important for us to get out to, you know, our network. But I also think, you know, maybe an article would be in order that we could as well, you know, disseminate through the NASA area. Of course, it shouldn't be restricted to NASA.
There's a broader discussion of this going on. I mean, really, I mean, I think Senator Bob Grimm's work, you know, on the 28 pages, including, you know, the federal judges, the process going on in Florida over the 80,000 pages of FBI documents relating to 9/11 that were never disclosed at the time of the congressional investigations, were denied to even exist. And through the work of Bob Grimm and others, you know, is coming to the fore, along with all the rest on the Saudi role. I think you know, you can see that the floodgates could open on all of us. You know, that we could really be at a point where we could force a house clean, of the most fundamental sort.
I think there's definitely a cultural targeting as well. It's been, you know, you can't separate the fact that you have the FBI, as you said, the involvement going back to the injustices, the murders around 9/11, the fact that that has not been solved or brought to justice yet, the murders that occurred there, and then that occurring again in Orlando just a few months ago, less than that actually. But we always talk going back to the targeting within, we just said the scientific community, the targeting within the music community, with people like the great bass baritone
Paul
Robeson and others around that. And then I was bringing up earlier the people in the film industry that were targeted. I mean, it was at different times, but the whole targeting was on the culture. If you try to do something that goes against the grain of being under control of the FBI and popular opinion, you will get attacked. If you try to do something that's going to inspire and uplift the population, as Einstein was doing, going after this what later became, I guess you would call the Congress of Cultural Freedom, you know, the people who wanted to attack real culture, you would be attacked. And that's what people are afraid of even today in the space industry.
Yeah, I mean, we had tried to pull together an event not long ago on where people who were not even NASA employees or had been contracts with NASA, who were just private citizens, private alumni of the program, to have a policy discussion on the future of the space program and what these senior thinkers would want the program to do, to move forward, to have a future, to have a mission again. And these people were told point blank that you're not allowed to do that, and if you try to do that, it will revoke your security credentials, and you'll no longer be able to do things with us at all. And you know, I think that you think about this event we went to the other day, where a Apollo 13 astronaut Fred Hayes was relating a story about one of the ways that he found meaning in his life today is because he would get invited to go talk to children at high schools and elementary schools about Apollo 13 and the importance of the space program. And so, this is the kind of thing that they're saying, well, we'll cut you off. You will no longer be allowed to even share your legacy with the world. We will cut you off. You will no longer, and it's not like their legacy is going to amount to anything if we don't have a mission at all, because it'll be forgotten. But this is, to really just put like a sensible, here's the kind of thing that they threaten people with to prevent them from even speaking up about the problems that they're being attacked. And they're not even prohibited legally from doing so.
That's true. I think it's really important. I think it should really also help crystallize, if you will, in people's minds the importance of leadership. I mean, leadership is a self-selection process, and these operations target those people who show the ability or actively express those qualities of leadership, and that's something many people they miss. They miss their own potential to be actors in history. Instead, they think in terms of, well, it's not popular. It couldn't happen because it's not popular, as opposed to, well, this is what needs to happen because it's true. This represents a insight, a discovery I've made or replicated into truth, and what action has to follow upon my knowledge of that truth. That's really what's important. The action on the basis of the truth. And that, of course, changes other people's minds, has the potential of changing what is, quote unquote, the popular opinion, changing what other people think. And so we end up with, as you know, we end up with people who are basically operating inside an invisible barbed wire fence, kept like cattle, and carrying on a discussion in terms of that are meaningless or virtually meaningless, gossip, basically.
What you said, which is actually important, is that in many of those cases where people actually did fight, they won. And so if the leadership were to realize, this organic leadership were to start talking with each other and not just be individuals, band together and realize, hey, look, this is how we're all being targeted, and we can fight this. Then I think what you would see is a potential for
well, yes, and that's what you see with the Berlin Conference, and that's what you see with the New Silk Road. I mean, we already have a majority, in the world. So we can build, and the more that people understand some of the way in which they've been manipulated in the past, will further that process, certainly. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I missed it. Who is this? Dale Brown again? You said
Dale Brown.
D-A-L-E?
Yes. Yes.
Well, who was he?
Well, he was a NASA subcontractor, right? One of a friend of the Jacksons, and through the Jacksons, he was drawn in, as a party in Hal, FBI Special Agent Hal France's operation, lightning strike operation, was entrapped. Is that it?
Yeah.
And he's the only one who fought the case and managed to get a very good attorney, Dick DeGuerin, and arranged to be represented by an excellent attorney and fought and won the case.
Yeah, there's a lot of self-censorship. This came out a couple of nights ago at the Ruder Planetary Institute meeting where Ian asked the speaker, well, should this be part of the presidential discussion debate? It is after, we don't want to politicize science.
We don't want to politicize.
We don't want to
science.
politicize asteroid defense.
He said he would be horrified if a presidential candidate brought this up, because that would make it a political subject instead of a scientific one. So I suppose he wants our politicians to just bring up meaningless drivel instead of actual policy issues.
Who said that?
This guy who was speaking, a scientist on asteroid defense.
Crane, yeah, Crane.
One of
No,
the,
Crane, K-R-I-N-G.
one of the leading asteroid planetary scientists in the country, if not the world. Yeah.
Okay, well, we can continue discussion. Why don't we wrap it at this point for this meeting? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.